You're listening to the Startups Without Borders podcast, episode 40. Rana Novack is a Syrian American advocate for refugees and the solution owner of IBM's Refugee and Migration Predictive Analytics solution, a first of a kind solution leveraging machine learning and cognitive computing to enable government agencies and humanitarian organizations better manage refugee crisis. In a very intimate conversation, Rana shares her tireless journey to support Syrian refugees from the US Senate to IBM and how she learned to get resourceful when all doors seem to shut down on her face. Hi, Rana. Welcome to the Startups Without Borders podcast. I'm super excited to have you today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for making the time and for sharing your story with us. As a first generation Syrian American, I can imagine what it was like growing up there, what it was like arriving there. Tell us a little bit about that girl. What was your childhood like and what did you want to be?
Oh gosh, what did I want to be? Good question. So I was born here in the US, outside of Washington, D.C. My parents had an arranged marriage. Both my mother and father are from Damascus in Syria. And so they got married there. And then my brother and I were born here in the US. And gosh, what did I want to be? For a while, I wanted to be a singer. I wanted to be Madonna. That would have been
Wow.
That would have been fun. I had a good childhood. A few years into, I was a few years old, and my parents ended up getting a divorce. There was a little bit of childhood trauma in there, and actually, my earliest memory is when we left my childhood home. My father had some abusive tendencies, and as a result, my mother decided that she was going to leave and raise my brother and I on her own, and raise us here in the U.S. And she did. So it was interesting. I sort of had this duality, I think, in my childhood where, on one hand, we didn't have a lot because I was raised by a single mother. But on the other, I had this very, rich culture and background. And, my mother raised me in a way where I never felt like there was anything that we wanted that we couldn't have if we worked hard enough for it. That was my childhood. And, actually, it's funny. What did I want to be? I think one of my earliest memories of what I wanted to be when I was a little girl, I remember being in school, and we had a storyteller come in, and she told these African folk tales. Why the giraffe has a long neck. These incredible stories. And I remember really vividly sitting on the floor with my class and listening to her tell these stories and thinking I wanted to do that. I couldn't articulate it further. I wanted to do that, just inspire people with stories. And she was so articulate and so magnetic. I just couldn't take my eyes off of her. So that's an interesting, interesting to follow that journey throughout my life, because in a way I do think I have become a bit of a storyteller.
Definitely. I want to pick up on that experience growing up, because 25 years later, you reconnected
Mm-hmm.
to something that had happened. I remember watching your TED talk, right? When you saw the refugee crisis in Syria, where your family was, where your relatives was, you reconnected to that memory of your childhood, right? To
Mm-hmm.
that trauma of having to leave and escape a home that was not safe. And you began
Mm-hmm.
mobilizing to help
Mhm.
And you finally, eventually reached the Senate, the US Senate, and John Kerry. Tell us all of that period. How did you gain courage? How did you, how was it like, or what was it like to fight to help people back in Syria?
Um, Gosh, well, it didn't feel like courage at the time. Um, that's I think the first thing. But the way that all came about, and I think it took some time for me to make that connection, right, between my childhood. When the war in Syria started in 2011, I had this very visceral reaction to it, and it was very, again, I'll use the word traumatic. It was sort of all over again. I was dreaming about it. I became just obsessed with wanting to help and what more I could do. And as things escalated, right, because right in 2011, nobody knew that it was going to get as bad as it did, and so I think for a while we were all just kind of hoping that things would be okay and that everything would go back to normal. But of course, that's not what happened. And the more things escalated and the violence increased, and my relatives that were still in Syria became more and more unsafe. They started to explore, how maybe if we were going to leave, what would that look like, and how would we be able to get out? And the more they dug into that, it seemed that it was going to be more difficult than they had imagined. So at some point, I think it was around 2012, 2013, my mother asked if there was anything that I could do to help. And it's not something that I had any experience with previously. So, I think the first thing that I did was I called my congressman's office and just asked. It's funny. I look back and I was so naive, and I think there's such tremendous value sometimes in just starting with a clean slate. But I didn't know anything, and so I had this. I think as a result, I had just no fear. Right? I would ask any question, and so I just called and said, "Hey, here's what's going on. Is there somebody that can help, or who can I talk to?" And again, similar thing. The more I dug into it, the more I learned that, this isn't going to be straightforward. I remember calling UNHCR too at one point. And this poor person who answered the phone, right? I just called and I said, "Hi, my family, my relatives are in Syria. And can you help? Is there somebody that can help?" And they said, "Well, no, it doesn't really work that way." And so I learned about the process, right? And about how, UNHCR is only going to kick in if my family were to cross the border and officially become refugees and register with the UNHCR. And I remember getting to this point, and I asked UNHCR. I said, "Well, okay, who is it then that helps them in Syria?" And there wasn't an answer, right? Yeah. They didn't have. So, at every point, like we just sort of had to reassess and figure out, okay, now what can really be done to help? I was ultimately unsuccessful. You mentioned the Senate and John Kerry, and how did we get to that level? I think I just kept asking questions, and when I was told no, there's nobody, there's nothing that I can do, then the next question was, okay, well, who can? Who is the decision maker? Who is it that I can talk to? I remember I had this epiphany throughout that time, which was, and it sounds so silly now because it's so obvious, but it's one of those things that once you realize it for yourself, right, it hits a little bit differently. And I remember having this realization that we make all of these rules, right? That, I think there's just this assumption that policy, because it exists, right, this is just the way that it is, and we all have to accept it for what it is. But I know it seems very obvious, but I had this realization that, oh no, this was created by somebody. Somebody has the power to change this. Yeah. Who's that person? And how do we do this, right? We make these rules for ourselves. And if it doesn't work for us, then that means that we have to do something differently. And so it was like always this hunt for, okay, who's the right person? Who can help my family? Who knows? If you don't know what kind of visa they need, who is it that knows the answer to this question? But yeah, they I wasn't able to get them here to the U.S. So ultimately, that it was unsuccessful in that way. But I think I ended up learning later that there were other things that I could do to help. Yeah. So yeah,
I think there's so many lessons, right? And we talked the other day when we met about getting up after every time you fall down, right? And this resilience that we hear, but when you really get to experience it, right? When one door is shutting down in your face, you look for another door, And interestingly enough, you found an unexpected door at IBM where you were working, right? Utilizing big data. How did that connection happen?
So that connection happened. I was actually at a really low point personally, and just with all of this that had happened, I felt like just this colossal failure, and it that it didn't matter how hard I worked or how high in the government I was able to get. None of it made a difference. And yeah, I was working at this global technology firm, and I was at this point where I thought, what am I doing here? I'm in the wrong place. I don't belong here. I actually thought maybe I should go into formally go work in policy. I got into law school. I applied and I got in, and then I had this moment where, okay, what am I going to do as a student sitting in a classroom? Am I going to be able to affect the kind of change that I want? And I was very transparent about this with my boss at the time. I went to my boss and I said, I don't know what I'm doing here. And my boss said, okay, time out, right? Take a deep breath. Don't do anything yet. Maybe give it some thought. And he encouraged me to just take some time. And I did. And I remember being at work and receiving an email about how we were using big data to revolutionize the cheese-making industry. And for whatever reason, this just was such a trigger. I just could not believe it. I was just indignant that this was how, and of course, I was looking at this through a lens of the refugee crisis and how there were millions of people that needed help. And here we were focused on cheese. For me, that was the spark, right? And I, again, I don't know what kind of chemical reactions happen, right? That those little things, motivate us or push us to go further. But I just had this thought, like, really? This is what we're doing? Why aren't we using this technology to help people? Why aren't we doing this? I know that we can. And that was really the first time that I thought maybe we could use big data and AI and the tools that we have to help refugees. I didn't necessarily know what that would look like, but I just knew that we could do better.
Right. I mean, and again, that's another story of lots of doors shutting down in your face, right? Because then you thought something could be done, I would love to know, how did you start researching how it could be applied to the refugee crisis and predicting refugee crisis? But then still nobody was listening, right?
Mm-hmm.
When did they
Yeah.
started listening?
Well, they started listening when I published an article in Wired magazine about how we can and should be using AI to forecast a refugee crisis and to help people. And that was again another low point. And it's also another place where I think being naive is really helpful, right? I'm not a data expert. I'm not a technologist. So, that allowed me to kind of ask those questions that I didn't have anything to lose. Well, why can't we use this for refugee crisis? I think there's so much value in that clean slate and being a little bit naive about something, because you're not afraid to ask those questions. And the refugee crisis was just hitting this peak, right? And the little boy, I don't know if you recall, but the 3-year-old boy had drowned on the Turkish beach, right? Remember that picture that just went everywhere? And everybody had this reaction globally, right? Like, oh, I can't believe this is happening. This is so distressing. I'm so upset. I can't believe it, which of course it's upsetting. Of course it's, and so on one hand, I was glad to see that people were responding appropriately. And I was praying that this little boy didn't die in vain, right? That maybe his death would give rise to some sort of positive change. On the other hand, I was really, really frustrated that people were shocked by this, because how could they be? We weren't doing anything differently, right? This had been, I think we were 4 years into the refugee crisis at that point, right? This was nothing new. This little boy was one of how many that had drowned trying to escape. So that was a turning point for me, where I all I could do was vent that frustration through storytelling and writing that article. And I also think it's really important to note that, I almost feel like I had these two worlds, right? I had my day job, and then I had my life outside of that, where I was so passionate about refugee advocacy, and I was writing and I was speaking. And so when I wrote that article, it was very much just me independently, no association whatsoever with my day job. And I was sure I was going to get fired for writing it, because I thought it was a little bit too close, right? I was talking about data and AI, and what we should be doing differently. So I was pretty scared for that too. I was so proud of it, but I was also terrified. I was sure that was the end of my career. So, that's how that came about. And then, then the idea gained traction, and we got things moving.
Right. I mean, I think it's fascinating that you thought you were terrified. You thought you were going to be fired, yet you did it, right? Yet you published it. Yet you, once again, that courage. You tried a political way. You tried many ways, many doors, all shut down. You found another way. Nobody would listen, and you kept trying and trying and trying. And I think there was a lot of courage there. Where do you think that courage came from?
Well, again, I would go back to, it didn't feel like courage at the time. And what is that saying? I'm not going to credit this properly because I don't know where it originated, but that's saying that, courage isn't the absence of fear, right? It's being afraid and then doing it anyway. And I think that's just where that's just where I was. I had gotten to this point, right, where that balance had tipped, and I guess I was more frustrated, and I felt more passionately about needing to be a voice in whatever way that I could, for this little boy that had lost his life, and that outweighed whatever risk might exist of getting fired. And so, I don't know. Is that courage? Maybe, but that's what I remember feeling is more than anything is just, I was angry. I was frustrated. I was really angry.
Like a calling inside of you telling you, there's no way to look to the side, right? There's no way to
right. Yeah. It gets to the point where it feels like you can't not do it. Maybe that's a good way to say it, is that to not do it would have been harder for me at that point. So, yeah.
And then, I mean, nobody would listen. You publish several articles until you got the one article that people would listen to, but then you still had to find avenues within the company, no less than IBM, a massive global corporation, finding avenues to actually implement that. How did that happen?
Well, I won't go into too much detail sort of about the inner workings just to, protect that. But I will, I can certainly speak about what it took from me, right? And sort of what I had to go through. And it took, first of all, teamwork. I think that's the first thing, right? Because as I mentioned, I'm not a technologist. I'm not an expert, right? It was not just, I wouldn't have been able to build a tool like this on my own. And it was about enough people feeling like, number one, yeah, we can do this. Technically, right? Yes, this is structurally sound and we can make this happen. Number two, is this the right thing for us to do? Does this make sense for us to do? Number three, actually building it, right? And building a proof of concept and being able to say, hey, we can do this. It's possible for us to do this. And I think that's a really interesting question about technology in general, right? If we can build something to help people, to make the world better, do we have a responsibility to do that? So, that was a phase that there certainly were obstacles involved, but I look at those as those obstacles, right? They just challenge you to think a little bit harder and to it was all positive. It was all positive. I had to stop and think, does this make sense for us to do? Can we actually do this? And I don't think that's ever a bad thing when you have to, you have those checks and balances in place so that you have to reflect on it. Maybe sometimes you have to hit rewind and start from scratch. And we also asked ourselves, if we do this, if we build this, would anybody really use it? And that's a question that I've been asked so many times. Even if we had this perfect information, do you think that anybody would respond differently to a refugee crisis? And that's a question for, I think everybody has to ask themselves. That says a whole lot more about us, doesn't it? Yeah. So, yeah. So Len, let me also just, I'm proud. I really am. I'm proud of, I don't know. I'm proud of my organization. I feel like we stepped up and we built this really cool thing. And I'm just, not a lot of companies would do that. And they believed in it. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us where does the project stand today? What are the latest happenings or latest updates about it?
So we partnered with the Danish Refugee Council, and they just have been tremendous. So I'd encourage anybody listening to Google the DRC and all their amazing work and see what they've done with this partnership and how they've taken the tool. We asked ourselves, just a lot of really interesting questions, right? What gives rise to a refugee crisis? Why does this happen? And the forecasting capability, they've really taken that and extended it out across many countries. And I'm so proud of what they've been able to do with it, because those are the organizations that, when we initially had this vision for this project, we wanted to help refugees. We wanted to help refugees. We wanted to help the people that are helping refugees. And for an organization like the DRC to take this and give it life just meant everything. So yeah, they've done some incredible work with it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I keep nodding. I keep nodding because I'm like, yeah, she did it.
We did it.
When you tell the story of how you know, the inception of this idea, how you connected these worlds, and when you explain, there's many times where you say, well, I'm not a technologist. Well, I'm not really the one doing it. And we mentioned this before. We talked about this before. There's a lot of imposter syndrome, which, as entrepreneurs is one of the main things or main obstacles we struggle against. This imposter syndrome, which you always feel, which you always think, and it's part of that psychology of not feeling good enough. How do you battle that? Or how would you advise any other entrepreneur to fight that instinct to say, I'm not good enough, this is not really my thing, who am I to talk about this? How did you fight all that, voice inside?
This is a funny question, because honestly, I feel that about imposters, right? Who am I to talk about imposter syndrome? It's just
you say,
right? Exactly. I think it depends on the day. I will say that. I've tried really hard to view it as an entity outside of myself, right? And if I can do that, then I can sort of talk to it a little bit and say, okay, if you want to come along for this ride, fine, but you can't drive. You can't sit in the front, right? You have to sit in the back and keep your mouth shut, and that's it. And so I don't know, sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But yeah, that's, confidence is an interesting thing, right? It's always, every day is a little bit different. How do we feel? I don't know that I have any tricks or,
but I love that, because
like
people keep telling us, or coaches, they tell you your self-talk is important, how you talk to yourself. And I wonder, but when am I talking to myself? How do I talk to myself? And what you just gave us is the clue to talk to yourself, right? The clue to kind of, in a very concrete way, in a very, concrete way that you can imagine even. Right? You sit in the back. So it's very graphic, which I love. So thank you for that, Rana.
Yeah. Oh, of course. Yeah. I love analogies. That's another one that, this I've heard more, connected to depression and anxiety, but I still think it works, is a black dog. Right. And so where's the black dog today? Right. If you kind of give it this identity, right? Is it in the front yard? Is it in the neighborhood? Is it in the country? Right? Where is it? And that's, I think, the first step is figuring out, okay, how am I feeling about this today? And then once you know where it is, then you can try to keep tabs and manage it a little bit differently. Another thing that I've, at least a work in progress, something that I try to do is, accept that nobody expects me to know everything all the time, right?
Yeah.
I am not, I don't have to be able to, I don't have to be a technologist. That's okay, right?
Yeah.
And in a way, I think that's part of why we were able to accomplish what we did, is because we needed somebody that, that couldn't get too down in the weeds. Somebody needed to have that higher level vision of what's possible. And then of course you need the people that understand how everything works. Maybe that's not the way that I can best add value. So it's about that. It's about appreciating your strengths, which is another thing that's tough for me, and I think a lot of people to do, is figure out what are you bringing to the table,
Yeah.
and give yourself some credit. Yeah.
I love that. You filled me with energy and with tools. With tools that I can use. Yeah, I love that. With tools that I can use to fight the imposter syndrome.
Yes. Fight it. Yes.
Thank you so much, Rana. It has been an amazing, amazing interview. Thank you for sharing your story, a very powerful one. And thank you for being on the podcast.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. And just thank you for everything that you do. Honestly, your organization is so unique and so important. I just want to take a minute to,
thank you so much.
It's all about empowerment, and I adore your mission. So keep up the good work. This was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rana. It really means a lot. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too. Bye.